Thank you everyone for joining us. This is our online series on YouTube, Cost Viz, which is a new series all about cost data visualization, cost data, cost estimating, cost analysis, where I get to interview guests from around the world who are subject experts in their field, who will be able to enlighten us in new ways of working, new theories, new practical steps, and things that will get you thinking. So with that said, our guest today is Doug Howarth, who is a legend in the game. So he's discovered this groundbreaking work called Hypernomics. He's got a new book, which is over my shoulder here, Hypernomics. He's also got this fantastic company called Hypernomics Inc. And we're going to talk all about that because they're doing some amazing work in terms of beating the market. And he's also got some notable collaborations in his past and his current work, working with the likes of NASA, Virgin Galactic, amongst many others. We could go on for ages. I think the best thing to do is just to welcome Doug to the show. So Doug, welcome to the show.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for having me. I've always appreciated your work, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be on it. Thank you so much.
Oh, the honor is most definitely mine, sir. So we're gonna break this up into a few different sections. We're gonna talk about hypernomics. It's all going to be centered around this because I love the term. It's very futuristic as well. But we'll jump straight into it in this first section. So my first question to you, my first question to you, Doug, is sort of more around your background. So if you could just give us a quick sort of 1 minute on your background. I know there's not enough time.
Oh, sure. 1 minute could sum it up. Out of university, and I studied economics in university, and part of me never believed what they were telling me. So I went off to, I love the aerospace industry, so I worked for a year for Boeing, and then 31 years for Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. And while I was at the Skunk Works, I kept noticing that programs would often fail. And as I was leaving the Skunk Works, I figured out that they were failing for a very specified reason. And that reason was that they were trying to break some limits that I eventually discovered. And so I've been spending the 12 years since I left Lockheed working out what these limits are. And this formed the basis for this new company and this new theory that we call hypernomics.
That is quite an awesome summary. I mean, we talked last year when we were both at the ICEA conference as well, yes. About a lot of things, ranging from economics to nuclear power to baseball to Moneyball. So we could go on to loads of different tangents here, but we're going to stick to a central theme, I promise, and there's going to be some great takeaways for you all. I should also say that this is going to be available audially as well. So it's going to be on the podcast, which is going to be relaunched as Cost Viz. It was previously the Cost of Everything podcast, but it's all going to get rebranded. So this will be available audio as well as on YouTube and Patreon, of course. So let's get into our questions. So the first one from me was sort of trying to imagine where hypernomics fits in with all theory around economics. So trying to imagine economics as this vast ocean, and there's so many different theories, there's new theories emerging all the time. Where do you see hypernomics fitting in this expanse?
I see it kind of enveloping most of what the current theories are, including the law of supply and demand, which is what classic economics touts. The law of supply and demand likes you to believe that there's an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, and that they intersect at one point, that there's an equilibrium. And you could see why past economists might have thought that way. I mean, if you live in a village in England, much like Adam Smith did, and you see that there's one price for an anvil and another price for bread, you could see how an equilibrium price would kind of start to become the main ideal. And then after that, Alfred Marshall started to diagram it. And the problem I always have with the diagrams is that the diagrams with their upward sloping lines and downward sloping lines don't represent any data. And as Amber, Paul, and I know from doing cost analysis, it starts with data. So what we did, we started taking lots and lots of data in. And if you take something as simple, say, as the electric car market, in 2014, there were 19 entrants in this market, and all of them were making money. And so there were these 19 independent points that were out there all gathering money. And so what happens? Well, it turns out that what happens instead of the law of supply and demand is the law of value and demand. And so it's very simple. It's got 4 clauses to it. It says product features drive value. 2, value pushes price. 3, price limits quantity sold. 4, quantity sold is a feature. And so what this creates, which this reveals, is that this is a system of opposing forces. As you add horsepower and range to electric cars, their value goes up. And people who can pay more will pay more. But as people pay more, there's only a certain number of people that can pay for the top of the line Teslas, and there's more that can pay for the lower range Teslas and still lower, and then the smaller cars that are out there. And that recognizes that there's a demand that as opposes the value. And so the law of value and demand looks at these opposing forces in a T-like structure that's outlined in the book, where everything starts at 0.0000 and expands outward from there. So this is a coordinate system. I mean, Descartes discovered his Cartesian coordinate systems, and what good luck they were named after him. But the thing of it is that these systems probably were in place, for anybody else to pick up, just like calculus was. And people anticipated calculus coming out. People, Leibniz and Newton basically released to the world the view of the infinitesimal with their calculus. And what's interesting about this is that nobody, to my great surprise, when I discovered this, had ever thought of putting everything at a 0 point and moving outward from that. So the way for people to think about it in the audience is to go to the South Pole, as the book shows, go to the South Pole. Instead of calling that 90 degrees south, call that 0 and call everything that goes away from it a different number, greater than 0, something positive. So in the book, we look at a hypothetical situation where the value in one section, call it, say, Australia, could be matched by the demand in an opposing direction, which would be, say, Argentina. So Australia and Argentina both share part of Antarctica. They have a common point that they intersect, or a common line. They intersect the Earth's axis. And so from that axis going outward, one can plot the value on one side and the demand on the other. And so supply, as it's commonly referred to, has little meaning in Hypernomics. There is a meaning to it, but it's very specific to the learning curve that happens to a product, and then the product demand curve that's a function of the value of the product. Maybe that's a little too deep at the beginning, but
No. I mean, we should have just really started with where did the term hypernomics come from? What I liked about is where the book started. The book is very thorough as well, and in trying to help. I think even someone with some basic understanding of economics like myself try to understand it from sort of the bottom up, and with I liked it going into the history of prior to Descartes as well, and then sort of take us on this journey of almost where this becomes a fundamental science. So the whole idea that, and I can't remember who said it, but if you wiped all of knowledge away, all of history and everything away, there's certain things that would reemerge because they're fundamental laws. And sort of linking it to that seems very, very antithetical to how I've seen economics build up as well. So some things that people have developed as new economic theory that you're like, well, that's based on some experience and it's not a law. It doesn't mean that anything's actually going to abide by that. It's just something that you've interpreted based on experience in a short period of time to explain some phenomena that economics hasn't traditionally sort of explained. So I guess it kind of links on to my next question, because like I said, there's all this theory all around us. There's always, there's so much information out there now. When did you get to that eureka moment with hypernomics, and what led you to discover it? Because obviously you said when you studied it, you sort of had some issues with what was being taught.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, the eureka moment is really rather pedestrian, and this just proves, ladies and gentlemen, you should always listen to your significant others. So, in my particular case, the moment of insight came on a very routine day. Our washing machine in the household had broken down, and so we traipsed around a bunch of big box stores in our neighborhood, and finally ended up at the local Best Buy. That's a big chain out here in the United States and in California. And so we rolled into the washing machine section. My wife comes up to the first machine. She says, the machine we have at home's got a pretty small drum. So I'd like to have more capacity in this next one. And I thought, capacity, for all you analysts out there, capacity versus price. You go, that's a two-dimensional problem. Then she said, our machine's only got one delicate cycle. And these other machines have a whole bunch more cycles. I'd like to have a machine that's got more cycles. And I thought, cycles versus price. She's up to a 3D problem. And so I really liked the machine we were looking at, and so did she. And then I saw the one next up the line, and it had more cycles and had more capacity. And of course, it cost more. I said, what about this one? And she said, it's too expensive. We can't afford it. And I realized that our purchase was going to add a quantity of one to the total quantity that had been sold for this machine over the course of a year or the course of its lifetime. And at that point was one of several points that were coming out for every model that was in the industry. And then I realized that was part of the demand. So that was the quantity. So my wife was solving for the capacity, the cycles, the price, and collectively we were solving for the quantity. And I looked around the store and I realized that everybody was doing this for every product in that store. And then by extension for every store in every market in the entire planet. And it turns out that the result of the book is people not only buy in that fashion, they actually self-aggregate their behaviors in a way in which we can describe with the little bit of math that we use in this thing. And so it's because of the self-aggregating behaviors that this theory has some real power to it. And so as we're going to get into the stuff about the stock market, there turns out to be some self-aggregating behaviors that happen in stocks. This theory just basically jams its previous knowledge into it and jams the self-aggregating theories into the stocks. And it's been doing pretty well predicting what the stocks are going to do.
Yeah, I think that was one of the interesting parts that we've discussed about sort of the applications of this theory, because there's a lot of theory out there, but it's how do you end up applying it? I think that's a useful example. It would be interesting to understand how many so on the next sort of scale up on the washing machine, whether they were different brands completely and whether they're all targeting slightly different markets by
the branding might have something to do with it. Sure. Yeah.
But I thought there's so many things you could include in sort of from a consumer's perspective on purchasing these things. But I think the power of it is the other way around, isn't it? In product design and establishing what the requirements are to understand what the market needs.
Yeah, especially you've got your podcast is called Cost Viz, and the thing that I've noticed as somebody who's been doing costs for decades is that typically the engineers in a company will come up with a design and then they'll pass it to the cost group and say, come up with a design. And what Hypernomics reveals is that sequence is exactly backwards. What one needs to do is one needs to see what the market wants, doesn't have, and can afford, and then find these open spaces, because there could be several in the market where it wants something, doesn't have it, and can afford it. And then work out the specifications that drive you into these individual little slots, and then pass that off to engineering, see if engineering can make it, and then pass it back to the cost people so that they can do the cost analysis. so that they can drive the product into the part of the market where, by interpolation or hopefully only a slight extrapolation, you can figure out exactly what the market will pay for when the product gets to it.
It's interesting if you start looking at sort of front end design, and how much of it is driven by a requirement on cost, and understanding exactly what you mean by cost. There's so many ways you can interpret cost. And different functions have different perspectives on what that means. And then you bring in a term that you've introduced around value, and that opens up a whole new front of what we mean, and value for who, and how do you define value that maybe can be subjective to the individual, sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's very interesting that you bring that up, and I suppose we should define value as it applies to hypernomics. Value in hypernomics means the sustainable price of a product based on its features. Now, so you were talking about qualitative things, and this is very interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. So we were working for a general aviation firm that was building a plane. And so the thing you might guess that might be important in a plane is, well, how many people can it seat? So you put that in, and you get statistically, you get an answer that says, yeah, I can predict the value of a plane based on the number of people it cover, but the air term is pretty large. So then you say, well, how fast does it go? And if you add the speed in, you get an equation with two independent variables, and the air term starts to reduce. And then you might say, what's the range of this plane? If the range is further, then it's shorter. It's going to fetch more still. And now you've got your air term next down. So we went with this one company. We got up to about 5 independent variables, including a safety chute that they had coming out the top to say what that was worth. That's kind of what they call an on-off variable or a step function. And they said to us, Doug, we think our plane is prettier than the average plane. Now that's a qualitative thing. So now, could you quantify the prettiness of our plane and see if that adds to the value of it? And so we kind of scratched our heads a little bit and said, well, I don't know. Let's go check it out. So what we did was our thought was, well, we'll give what we call 3-view drawings. So you see the plane from the front, the side, and the top. So we gave 3-view drawings of all the planes that were in the database. We passed them out to people that were in our circle. And then we asked them to rate the planes from 0 to 10 on how attractive they thought their lines were, separate and apart from the paint job. Just how attractive are the lines on this thing? And it turned out that there was an added value for the attractiveness of the plane as viewed by the people that were buying the planes. And it turned out that the plane that was at the top of the list was one of the highest priced planes. And so it was getting added value from its looks. And our customer actually found out that they were close to the top too. And so they could actually charge more for their plane based on its appearance because they had spent some time trying to make it look really nice. I mean, somebody pointed out to me, like, when it comes to electric cars, if you look at the first electric car mass produced, and your listeners can look it up, but you can look up the Mitsubishi I-MIEV. And it was not very elegant compared to, say, a Tesla that's rolling around now. Even the lower Teslas, roughly the same price as this Mitsubishi when it rolled out now. Of course, there's been learning. That's what's enabled the Tesla to come down in price. But it wasn't very attractive. And so it basically came into the market and left as other people made more attractive products. But that gets back to your qualitative thing there, is that basically you're asking people their opinions. And if they can quantify their qualitative opinions, and sometimes they can, then you can push that back into the data and get some really interesting results.
That's fascinating. And it's quite interesting, sort of, I deviated there by starting to talk about value that isn't defined in terms of economic value and the terminology used in sort of hypernomics as well. I think, taking it back to hypernomics in the context of wider economics as well, I guess the way that I've worded this question is that traditional economics gives us a map of the terrain,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of having read some of the work that you've done prior to releasing the book as well, it's this multi-dimensional aspect. So rather than this 2D view, as we mentioned before, introducing multiple dimensions, and how Hypernomics is more of a 3D model rather than just the terrain. And then I guess, how do you, we've talked about applications, and we've also talked to, you've answered some pretty interesting ways in which the hypernomic theory has also allowed this additional, traditionally it's looked at as like goodwill or brand or something like that, but actually the physical form being considered more beautiful.
Right. Yeah.
How sort of, if you consider wider business as well, it can be technological, non-technological, service industries, whatever. But how does the model actually change the way businesses navigate the market or their individual markets?
Well, if you understand that for established markets, and by established markets, we mean markets that have typically about 24 entrants or more in it. So that would be a market that typically has enough data for us to characterize statistically significantly. If you can characterize the market's limits, and we call that a demand frontier, and you can see how the demand frontier is moving over time. So you characterize it for a point in time, and then you try to see if you can go backwards if there's enough data, and then you go forward if there's enough data. You can understand what the limit is. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, suppose I were making a supersonic, suppose I was a billionaire, and suppose I wanted to make a supersonic business jet. And I talked to all my friends, and all my friends said, wow, that's a great idea. You build it and I will come. And so that you might just take a poll of all your friends, and they said, well, I polled 1,000 of my friends, and 500 said they would buy it, and I'm going to believe that number. Well, it turns out that business jets exist right now. And so you can figure out what the prices are for other business jets. And it worked out that there was a company called Raytheon that was founded by a billionaire. And he decided he was going to build something called the Raytheon AS2. It was a supersonic business jet. It was going to go 925 miles an hour, carry 8 to 10 people, and go across the Atlantic if it wanted to. And so he worked out the cost. We're all cost people, and the cost had the right number of digits. The development cost was probably adequate to the task. So I said, that's good. And then our value analysis says, well, what's it worth based on its features? And it was worth every penny of the $120 million that he was charging for it. In fact, it may have been worth more. Probably was worth more to some people. It was definitely worth $120 million. But then the third question to ask is, well, what's the demand for this thing? So most people most companies, the airliner companies, the Boeings and the Airbuses, when they release a new aircraft, they've already gone out to all their clients. They've got this design that they've created and said, if we build this, will you take an order? And what they do is they take orders before they start. And very often they launch with enough orders to guarantee financial success for this line. This billionaire launched with 20 orders, and he wanted to get 300 in a decade and 500 overall. And so when he launched, there was enough money there for 47. If you're right on this demand frontier, of course, there's an air term around it. And then 5 years later, he still had the same 20 orders. No more, just 20 orders. And the line was moving in his direction. It had gone from 47 to 63. So that was a pretty significant move. But recall, he wanted 300 of these guys. And so I worked out the odds, according to me, about what his chances were to do what he wanted to do. And it came out to about 1 in 40. So I wrote a little piece on LinkedIn that said, worth every penny, not enough pennies. And I talked about why this thing wouldn't work. And then I got an angry reply from somebody I knew, it turned out, that I'd worked with before at Lockheed, who said, wow, we just got this big order in and you're all wet. And I said, well, your order's all for options, by the way. And even with if every order converted directly to a plane, you're still only at 90 and you wanted 300, you're not going to make it. And then 6 months later, they went bankrupt. So the reason that you need to do this kind of analysis is that if you don't understand the demand, you can go bankrupt. Now, another guy that didn't understand that, maybe some of your listeners have heard of DeLorean. If they haven't heard of John DeLorean, they probably saw Back to the Future and they saw the DeLorean car. Well, John DeLorean built this car, and now he missed both the demand and the value. So what he did was he built this car. For those of you that can't remember, it was a stainless steel sports car with gull wings, and it was very attractive. It had some very nice lines, and the gull wings made it really futuristic. And he goes out and he starts building this thing, and he's going to build 10,000 in a year, and he wants to charge $25,000. That's his price. But our analysis suggested, because he only had 130 horsepower in this roughly, that his car was only worth $15,500. In order to get what he wanted to charge for the horsepower portion of his car, he needed to actually double the horsepower. And so sports cars enthusiasts like horsepower. And so what happened was he had overpriced the car. Some people bought it because there's people at the end of the distribution, as we like to say, that were interested in it. But he had overshot the price and he'd overshot demand, and he ended up going bankrupt. And then you can do the reverse can happen. And so there's another company, again, back to aerospace, the seventh employee from Microsoft, a guy named Vern Rayburn, decided to go out and build a very small business jet, a practical one for people who wanted to upgrade from piston engines and turboprops. He built himself a 5-place private jet that had 2 engines, and it was going to go 430 miles an hour, carry 5 people, and had a 1,400 mile range. And he priced it at $775,000 to start with. Now, our analysis suggested it was worth about $2.2 million. In fact, if you do if any of your people know an S-curve, the chance of him having the price correctly was about 3%. In other words, it was 97% of the distribution was off to the higher end of the price. And he gradually started to increase the price, but he ended up getting, as you can imagine, if you price something at 40% of what it would have been worth, imagine pricing your house at 40% of what it's worth. He got hundreds and then thousands of orders. He had 2,600 orders that he held. He was going to sell more jets than Gulfstream was selling. Gulfstream only sells, 600, 700 of them in a decade. He was going to sell 3 times that much if he could build them. But he didn't have enough margin, and he ended up going bankrupt. So there's a reason for doing all this work way in advance. This work takes anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and maybe very low millions. But you're talking, in the case of that Ariane, that was billions. DeLorean was hundreds of millions. The Eclipse Aviation, that's the little small business jet, that's another $1 billion loss. It's something that can help you avoid financial ruin, but before you ever get to the point where you might commit financial ruin. And so it's trying to let you drive to where you need to go based on what the people are telling you that they're buying.
Yeah, and that's got so many applications in different industries where understanding what the market is, that's every business, isn't it? That's really so. What I found quite interesting is, as you were talking there, just for some reason, the film industry came into my mind about how, some people, some companies get it so wrong, and some companies just, knock it out the park in terms of understanding what they need to produce in order to have, a box office smash hit.
Yeah.
And it's not always obvious what the variables are that affect that. Especially if you're, I'd say, sitting in your ivory tower in LA, knowing what's going to actually do well.
Right. Yeah.
You can really be surprised by what actually becomes a hit. So, I wonder if someone will start using Hypernomics to work out what the next box office hit's going to be outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Interestingly, I have an actor friend that's actually asked me to start doing that. I've kind of wandered off into some other things, but it does seem feasible to be able to come up with a reasonable predictor for moderate to, pretty good success using a model like this. My guess, and usually my guesses have been pretty good in this region, is to find somebody that's very good as an actor, but unknown. And the same thing with the director, very good, but unknown. That means you're basically getting them at a discount. And if you can get them at a discount and get a decent script, and of course the way to measure the script is to have it read by people that you would trust to be able to do that. My guess is that there is some sort of formula out there that could be produced that would suggest how to make a hit on the cheap. I mean, we've seen now that the world's kind of migrated to sequels that are tried and true, and of course the Marvel universe and every other universes there are out there. The big blockbusters, they're pretty much guaranteed to have an audience because they've had an audience. But if you were to try to make something new, there's probably a formula out there that you could come up with, again, using quantitative analysis on qualitative features. And we saw that only a couple of times so far. I mean, I gave you the example of the aircraft, but it seems feasible for us to be able to draw that for different industries. And it's just a question of how clever your customers would be and the analyst would be to try to describe that. That it turns out that you really have to listen to your customer base when you're trying to do the analytics. So going back to the aircraft example, we thought we had thought of everything. We got a parachute, we've got the range, it's got a diesel engine, we've got all these factors, and we had about 5 factors, maybe 6. And then they said, what about the appearance? And we kind of go, they just threw us aback. And I said, well, that's a great question. I wish I'd thought of that, but we're thinking about it now. Let's go ahead and think on this. And then it turns out that it's vastly important. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to predict human behavior. So you got to listen to the humans. You got to listen to the humans.
Yeah.
You've got to see what your customers want, all your people in your chain would think about it, and see what's happened in the past, and then try to predict the future. So another key point to what we try to do is we try to take what we call the distant past, the near past, and the present to predict the near future. So I know that you're out there in England and you like your football, and you can imagine a footballer striking the ball. And so the distant past might be the ball was hit 2.5 seconds ago. And then the near past might be it was hit 1.5 seconds ago. And now the present, it's right by you here. And so based on the 2.5 seconds, 1.5 seconds, and now, you'd say, well, in the next half second, I predict it's going to go here because I understand it's got a certain speed and it's got a direction to it. And that's what we kind of try to do is there's a certain economic mass that matches the mass of that ball. And once it's pushed into motion, it's going to remain in motion until it's acted upon by another force. Now, economic forces are trickier than the wind, but if a gust of wind hits that ball right after it goes past you, it's not going to go exactly where you predicted. But if a gust of wind doesn't hit it, it's more likely to go where you thought it was going to go. And so the idea is to pick up as much information about where it's been a long time ago, short while ago, and now to predict where it's going to be pretty soon.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
And selecting no, absolutely. And I think you're right, because these are sort of human systems that would, or heavily influenced by, people.
Mm-hmm.
It means that you need to be very, very selective on which variables are actually influence that trajectory. And I find that quite fascinating is how you go about selecting those variables. But this, I guess, just to go back to some of these questions, and a lot of what we're trying to cover in this is around visualizing this, visualizing this application, and also just visualizing the impact. I don't want to talk too much about what's behind you, because obviously we've got the plaques on the wall, which is fantastic. We also see the copy of the book, but we also see, I used to see them in chemistry sets.
Yeah, these are solid 4D. These are 4D models that we built on a 3D printer that consists of 2D planes that you can hold in one hand. So, in a way for the people that are seeing this, and if you're listening, you can imagine that what this looks like. Imagine a T in 3D, and then the T in 3D is just standing up, and you're seeing the top of the T, you're seeing the inside of the top of the T. And on the right side, you're seeing, in this case, this is the Dow 30. And so these are 30 stocks that we have the quantity going to the right of this, on the right-hand side of that T, and then the price going vertically. So the quantity here this is the volume for that particular day, and this is back in June 20th, 2019. And you see what happens here is there's this black line. That black line is the demand frontier. There is a demand frontier for stocks. There's an upper frontier, then there's an outer frontier, with one exception. Amazon has got its own little zip code. But everybody else beyond Amazon abides by, all the other 499 stocks in the S&P 500 abide by this line. And there's also a minimum too, which is to say that if you're good enough to get into the S&P 500, you're guaranteed a certain amount of quantity versus price. You're guaranteed a certain cap based on that. And that's another important point. And so these prices then on this side, the prices here are they're relative to their quantity. On this side, we're looking at their adjusted earnings per share on this axis. And then on this axis, we look at their return on assets. And it turns out that some of these points are above this plane. This plane represents the plane of best fit for just those two variables. Now, we typically would look up to 5, 6, 7 variables at one time that don't conflate that don't have cross correlations to them over 0.7 for those of you that study that stuff. But basically means that we're not trying to explain the same thing twice with the same variable, with a different form of the same variable. But anyway, points that are below this plane, which are stocks, may be undervalued, and points that are above this plane may be overvalued. So this is 2019. This is the halcyon days of this company named Boeing. You may have heard of them. Boeing at that point they're way above the line. So this line doesn't consider, back to the point we were talking about. Boeing had a backlog in their commercial arena of something on the order of 5 to 7 years. If they didn't get another order, it would take them 7 years to fulfill every order they had back here. And this is before the MAX incidents and the door blowing out and all that kind of stuff. And so this is showing you the influence of these confounding variables. Like, okay, well, how do I study the back orders for, Colgate Palmolive? Well, geez, I don't know how to work the back orders out for a company that makes toothpaste, but the company that makes airplanes, that's something else that adds to their value. So you have to you may have to add some other thoughts into this, into figuring out what's going on. But the 4D system there, interestingly, then you compare that 4D system up, that's the airplanes, you compare it up to the engines that go into that. And the engines have their own 4D system. And so since they share the price axis in Hypernomics, one 4D system plus another 4D system, 4 plus 4 equals 7, because they share this price axis. And so we're working out a model right now as we speak that's going to be an anatomy, and you'll be able to see this, Rapal, when we go to Minneapolis. We'll have a model that'll show you where the engines are on one side of the market and where they fit on their aircraft on the other side of the market. It becomes basically an anatomy class for the hypernomics that apply to those adjacent markets. And we think that's going to be pretty useful to people.
Yeah, I think being able to capture so many variables is, it's sort of tantalizing, I would say, for a lot of organizations out there, I think. But also, just as if you're an investor, I mean, there's like I said before, there's all these theories on economics and people trying to understand as well. Mm-hmm. From a cost perspective, what is the intrinsic value of an organization and whether they've been undervalued or overvalued.
Right. Yes.
And what complicates that now going forward is a whole view on sustainability and understanding sort of sustainable, I don't want to conflate the terms, but sustainable earnings,
Right.
but also the fact that there's a large influence now on organizations presenting their ESG credentials and also including that in their equity story, and so how does that then sometimes skew or misrepresent what their intrinsic value is? So I think it's fascinating how it's what we're saying here is that the principles around hypernomics could be unveiling some of these invisible forces that might not be apparent. I think one of the things that would be quite interesting, and this is a question, trust me, but one of the things that's quite interesting is how, because these are invisible, and we've talked already as well about how by applying this, you're able to present almost a new data, but it's the same data, but new way of looking at the data to say there's some risks around your model here. There's some risks around how you're pricing it here. So apart from that, is there an instance where the insights that you produced led to a surprising business decision or an innovative approach by that business?
Yeah, I can't reveal for whom we did this work, but we were asked at one point to say, well, what would happen if this certain product became 10 times safer than it is right now? And so this particular product line was extremely safe. There were very few losses of the product over time. But it turned out that if you looked from the product that had the least number of failures to the one that had the most number of failures, there was a difference of about 2 orders of magnitude or so. And so it worked out that this particular product, if you made it 10 times safer, and mind you, the safety requires a lot of testing. So people are eager to get to market, but they're not eager to do the testing. Well, how eager would you be to do testing if you knew that if you made it 10 times safer, it would return over 50% more price value to you, to your customers? That was unexpected. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who may not know Amberpaul as well as I do, I know he works in the market where he's trying to put some small nuclear energy back into the grid. And the value of safety in nuclear engineering is something that has not been well understood by the masses. I mean, think how many people have died in coal mines since coal mines have been invented. So the nuclear, we have these spectacular disasters, Fukushima, Chernobyl, and then 3 Mile Island was a smaller one. But what happens is these things just get built up out of proportion. And so now you've got Germany just to the west of you, where the chancellor at the time, who was a nuclear physicist, is taking the reactors offline. And she's trying to swap it out for solar in a northern clime, when I'm thinking, well, geez, you had it right the first time. You had reactors that never had a problem. Your safety record was perfect. And what's happened here is that people get so hyped up that they don't understand the true value of how the electricity gets produced. And a big part of that for the nukes is it's so much safer than everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I thought was very interesting there. And that just on that, I think Germany are looking to try and reverse their decision now to try and bring it back, because they've realized it wasn't probably the best decision.
Right.
But including those aspects, including trying to include safety, energy security, which has multiple meanings, but for nuclear has, there's different meanings you can apply to energy security, but valuing those as part of your decision-making criteria on whether to select a particular technology for energy generation. It's just not there. It's all done on a very spurious sort of life cycle cost comparison.
Right.
Which tries to compare, apples and oranges. You're trying to compare wind turbines with nuclear power, almost trying to solve this question of which one's cheaper without actually understanding which one's providing you more value in this particular situation.
Right.
So, it definitely does kind of, I wonder, applying hypernomics to that particular equation, what that would reveal.
I think it would be fascinating. My hypothesis going in is that nukes are vastly undervalued. I'm not saying they would be useful in every case, in every place. I mean, of course, you're out here in Southern California where I live. Solar is a good answer because the sun's overhead, 300 plus clear days a year. Solar is a good answer out here, but is it a good answer in Germany? Solar? Why is Germany going back? Well, they had it right the first time. And, you and more, the Midlands of England, more north still. I mean, nukes have got to be a part of the solution, I would think. And, they've gotten a bad rap because of these, the few tragedies that happened. But think of all the coal mine accidents, just coal mining. Now you don't even have to put in oil refinery or, any solar incidents that have happened or wind generation incidents, all of which have more incidents than nukes. This would just be something that could help the planet out. And we're hopeful that the analysis, which by the way works for the government too. One of the things I was going to try to interject here is that here in California, they want to raise more taxes. And so what's their answer? Well, I'll raise the tax rate. Well, who told you that was a good idea? Well, why is it a bad idea, Doug? Well, I said, if that tax rate slope, the frontier, has a slope less than, for those of you who study this thing, has a slope less than, because it's going to be a power curve. If the slope is less than -1, that means that it's relatively flat. That means if you drop the tax rate, you will get more tax dollars. And so in the state, they often, they want all the money from the rich people, but they treat them, like junk. And now they have this, in LA County, they've got a mansion tax. And so a lot of the wealthy people are leaving and they want to keep trying to jack up the other taxes. What you really should do instead is you should start to lower the tax rate. I mean, one of the richest countries in the world is Monaco. What do they do there? They just got a flat VAT tax on everybody. And, it's phenomenally wealthy. And so what people don't understand is that this works for everything, including the government, procurement, taxation, expenditures, everything that you want to do when it involves money, Hypernomics applies to. So that's
fantastic.
And astonishing insight.
I think that's the perfect sort of plug for the book, actually. So Doug, you got a copy there. I think.
Yes.
It's over this shoulder for me.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can see it over Emerald Paul's head here. This is Hypernomics using hidden dimensions to solve unseen problems. It may sound complicated. What's interesting about this is that you already know, because you're in the economy, you already know all the forces that are involved here, and you've known them your whole life. This just simply reveals how they're arranged in a way you haven't seen before, and it's in a way in which you can use it. And so the book starts out with Hansel and Gretel, and it eventually graduates to a 16D view of a subset of the world's GDP. And every step of the way is predicated on the steps before that. And so it really just looks at things and reassembles them in a way in which you can use them.
That's fantastic. And yeah, I would vouch for that. I think what was quite funny, so I was in Oxford earlier today, and they've got, and I went in there and I saw a copy. So I didn't take a photo of it because I've got my little one running around, so I couldn't quite get the phone out to take a picture. But next time I'm in there, I'll take a picture of it.
But it's
available. Yeah.
Oh wow! How about that?
And, so it's available. It's available sort of nationally, internationally. It's obviously on Amazon and all places online as well, right?
Right. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, and Wiley too. It's a Wiley book.
Perfect.
So Wiley's got it.
Yeah, it's Wiley book, so it'll be on Wiley as well. So we'll drop a couple of links as well in the description so that people can get their own copy. Fully agree. It's a really accessible book. It's not a theoretical book. It's a very practical look at new ways of unveiling invisible forces in the market that, we're always looking, everyone's looking for, I guess, an angle or an edge to try and understand things a bit better and try and understand the market better. And I think I can't think of a better way to try and do that than with Doug's book. So, before we close, just a quick plug for the Patreon channel. So the Cost Viz is on Patreon as well. I'm putting new content on there as frequently as possible, and some of it also includes what Doug's going to go on to now, which is just some additional sort of in-depth view, a bit of a deeper dive into the technical aspects, which would be great for yourselves as well as viewers and listeners. Get those deeper insights and anecdotes as well. We'll see how far we get. We've run out of time very, very quickly, as always happens when as always happens when I'm talking to you, Doug. Is the time just flies, and we wonder where it's all gone. So, but yeah, if you're on Patreon, or if you want to sign up, it's free. So just feel free to search for Cost Viz, and links in the description as well. And yeah, all that's left for me to do really is to thank you, Doug, for your insights. We've talked about how you can get a view of the book. There's more on Hypernomics there. There's also your website.
Yeah, hypernomics.com's got our basically a little, blogs, and the blogs are also on LinkedIn. LinkedIn has more discussions from other people about how they see what it is that we're doing. So I would suggest going to my LinkedIn page for many of you, because I put up little short blurbs that talk about how we can use hypernomics in everyday life. And so a lot of people have found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's not all to do with just markets. You post things that are sort of unrelated to markets, but relate to this theory and this application of hypernomics. So one more time, I guess, just thank you so much for joining me on the show. Your support's always valued, and yeah, just wish you all the best with this book.
Well, thank you so much, Amber Paul. I really appreciate the time that you've spent with me here. I've always enjoyed your show, and I look forward to seeing you in Minneapolis in May.